never trust. Yeah, no, I don't wanna waste what's left. And on we'll go. I don't wanna waste through the wastelands, through the highways, through my shadow, through the sun rays. We'll go. We'll go through the wastelands, through the highways, and on we'll go. close till I get up. Time is barely on our side. I don't wanna waste what's left. The storms we chase are leading us, and love is all we'll ever trust. Yeah, no, I don't wanna waste what's left. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, till my shadow turns to sun rays. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways. And on we'll go. Finding life along the way, melodies we haven't played. No, I don't want no rest. Echoing around these walls, fighting to create a song. I don't wanna miss a beat. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, till my shadow turns to sun rays. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways. And on we'll go. And we'll grow in number, fueled by thunder, see the horizon, turn us to thousands. And we'll grow in number, fueled by thunder, see the horizon, turn us to thousands. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, till my shadow turns to sun rays. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways. And on we'll go. Hold me close till I get up. Time is barely on our side. I don't wanna waste what's left. The storms we chase are leading us, and love is all we'll ever trust. Yeah, no, I don't wanna waste what's left. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, till my shadow turns to sun rays. And on
Hello. Let's see. All right, looks like we're live. Good evening, everyone. Good morning, wherever you're at. This is first stream, simultaneously streaming to Twitch and YouTube. So if there's any sort of hiccups, please mention something in the chat, and I'll try to work through it as we move along tonight. So I guess I'll start introducing myself. Name's Danny Wade. You see me online probably as DevNet Dan if you follow me on Twitter, or read any of my network automation content or my blog. So the reason I guess before we even get into the stream itself or what I'm kind of be working on, just to give a little background. So I started in networking about 5 years ago. I quickly fell in love with it, just jumped right into, got my first job, jumped into the CCNA, and as soon as I started, I worked through the CCNA and got to work with other engineers, configuring devices, deploying devices or network devices, and soon quickly realized there has to be a better way, right? If you've been in the network engineering field, that your companion is a notepad throughout your first few years of deploying a switch, or you're given a configuration file and it's a text file. I quickly found Cisco's DevNet, hence the DevNet part of my alias, I'll call it. So I found that probably mid 2018. I started looking at network automation using Cisco's DevNet, their free learning. And as I kind of went through and learned about what an API is, and started diving into Python, I really enjoyed the programmatic side of networking and overall network automation. So pretty much been in that for the past few years. It's kind of been a mixed role. I think anyone in network automation, there's just now more network automation engineer roles. So if you're in network automation, I would say even a year back, 2 years back, you're pretty much still held to the doing network engineering alongside automation, because obviously without the network engineering piece, you really don't understand how to automate it, or hopefully you're not trying to automate any networks that you don't really understand. So I've kind of been in a hybrid role in network engineering and the automation. So more specifically around automation, my first experience with automation was around the Meraki API. So I don't know who's familiar with Cisco's Meraki platform. If you look at it, it's a cloud-based solution. It has a web UI that you mostly interact with. There's really no CLI. It's very for traditional network engineers, it's kind of it's feature lacking. I mean, that was honestly one of the first thoughts that comes to your head when you only have a web UI. So that one of the first things I found through the Cisco DevNet program was, hey, you can automate that. It has an API, which for new people kind of jumping into this or watching it tonight, watching this stream, I'll go over that. I mean, I won't go over the definitions and show you dictionary definitions, but I will kind of go over what's an API, and honestly, more specifically, what's the benefit of an API, because ultimately that's what we want to know. You don't want to learn about just the acronym. You want to understand how it can help you. So so I kind of got started with the Meraki API, figured out how to interact with APIs using a tool called Postman, which if you're into the automation space at all, you'll definitely know that tool, or you should. And then quickly learned how you can interact with APIs using Python. So most of what I do now is strictly with Python. And honestly, I'm happy that's kind of the path I went. There's definitely throughout my automation journey, I've went through and looked at, like I mentioned, Meraki's API, and then I looked at I guess you could call platforms like Ansible and Terraform. Not so much Terraform, but more Ansible, because that's kind of one of the first, like, hey, welcome to network automation. Here's Ansible, try it out. And then, you write your first playbook. It's super easy, super easy to understand, super easy to write. Push out your first configuration or your first, gather your first show output. And sure, and that's one of the most exciting things, because you get back the response and it's like, whoa, I just interacted with a network device programmatically. But yeah, looked at the Meraki API, then looked at Ansible for interacting with your traditional iOS XE, Cisco devices. And now I'm kind of in the realm of, what can I do with Python, and kind of really build my own tool. It sounds crazy enough, but there's plenty of people out there in the community. I know, like, I don't know if he's watching, but John Capobianco, he has a tool called Merlin. He's very public about, he posts videos on YouTube. They're very informational, and he kind of goes step by step. He goes through his trial and error. So, given all that background and just a little understanding about me and my network automation, networking journey, I'll kind of dive into the purpose of this stream. So the reason I started this stream was back whenever I first started, especially with just networking overall, there weren't really too many, I'll call, online personalities. The two biggest popular and still biggest popular personalities out there, David Bombal and Network Chuck, they both had a much smaller following back then, 4 or 5 years ago, but it was just neat to see, someone being public, kind of a public face to these concepts. Hey, thanks, James. Hey, you're the very first person in my chat, so I appreciate that. So anyways, where was I? Yeah, so David Bombal, Network Chuck, they both really, got me excited. I remember watching their YouTube videos and waiting for their content to be released, because at the time, they were the popular, at least, like I said, in my eyes and what I saw, and through the YouTube algorithm that presented me with the videos to watch. There definitely were others out there, but I found them to be the most entertaining and provide the most information. So got to watch them, and kind of since then I've been working through the network automation grind, and just until recently I've just figured out, hey, it would have been awesome to have someone that was going down my path, or at least starting the, specifically around network automation, that was out there, that could be streaming, posting YouTube videos. There's a bunch of great YouTube creators out there, so I'm not going to even start naming them. But presently, there's just a bunch out there that's, networking, network automation, studying for your CCNA, CCNP. There's a bunch of great content creators out there. So kind of, where I'm going with this is, if I can provide a couple streams a week that I can just go, I work through this, I'm working through this personal project right now. And I figure if I can stream it and answer any questions while we're live, and then if there's interest around a particular subject with my, any of the content on my stream, I may make smaller YouTube videos, hopefully 10 minutes max, to go over one of those concepts. So I guess without further ado, I'll go ahead and get started. So I'll go ahead and at a very high level and explain kind of my projects, what I'm working on, and kind of answer any questions if there's anyone in the chat. This tool that I'm using, it's called Restream. It consolidates the Twitch and the YouTube chat room. So if there's anyone out there, no matter if you're on Twitch or YouTube, I should be able to view your questions. So I got James. It looks like his came from YouTube, but anyone that has questions throughout this stream, let me know, and I'll try to monitor the chat. That's probably why if you notice that my eyes are facing like one side of the screen, it's because that's where the stream is, the chat, and kind of monitoring the stream. So that's kind of why I'm looking at the one side. But I'm gonna go ahead and open up VS Code. Actually, before I even start jumping into the code, let me show you what this tool looks like. And it's not really a tool, I guess, but so I'm creating this I guess I'll just call it a tool web app. It has a very generic name right now called NetCheck, and basically what the point of this tool is it's going to provide a validation and analysis of your network, and underneath the hood it's using two different open source projects, well, for the most part open source, PyATS and Genie, and for the validation piece, or what I'm calling the validation piece, and then for the analysis piece, it's using a tool called Batfish, and we'll get into those as we kind of go through. And tonight I plan on just keeping everything pretty high level. If there's, like I said, if there's any questions about any of this, like, okay, he said Batfish, like, well, what's that? Like PyATS, never heard of it. Yeah, we can definitely go over that. Just keep your keep any questions in the chat, and I'll kind of go over them as they come in. So here, and I'll go over kind of how this is built as well in the back end once we get to the code. But here's kind of the home page. So simple welcome. These tests here are meant to validate and analyze your common use cases. So I mentioned John, and I'll mention him again just because his project, it's so great for anyone kind of getting into I would say, discovering just information about your network. That's the best way to put it. His project Merlin, and I may try to find a link here if we have time towards the end of the stream. But he has a tool that's also a web app, and it's used to gather information about the network devices. Most recently, I saw that he's able to track changes. So he basically captures the state of the network, and then we'll go through and capture this state again and see if there's a difference between the two states. So if anything a VLAN gets deleted or anything of that nature, he's able to through his tool you can easily visualize that. So it just has a wealth of information. This tool that I'm creating basically will take common use cases. So it'll gather a lot of information, but it will only gather information that it needs to perform its what I call the common use cases or common checks. So as you can tell, I kind of broke this tool into two different sections. So we have validation and the analysis. As I mentioned, validations ran by PyATS, and analysis is going to be integrated with Batfish. And I'll go over both of what they do here in a little bit. So quickly go over to the validation screen real quick. So as you can tell, this is a work in progress. I've been working on this for probably on and off about a month now. Definitely done the build it out and then didn't like it, scrapped it, rebuild it, and I'll kind of go through that as well. So the only common use case that I have for right now, and my goal is to basically build out the common use cases very deliberately and try to make it exact or most accurate as I can, because I don't want to have to go through and refactor any of the checks that are done, because there's just so much information being gathered on the back end and parsing that I want to be able to make the checks very verbatim, I guess. So So what's checked? So with the circuit upgrade, so a circuit upgrade is a very common uh, use case for a validation check. So, no matter if you're CCNA, CCNP, I mean, it really depends on the importance and the visibility of the site that's being upgraded. We all go through doing circuit upgrades at some point in our career. So some of the things that I just put down, and these are all just off the top. So, if there's anyone watching that's like, hey, this is like a common thing that we do. It'd be great to have that check. I'm definitely open for criticism or feedback, because honestly, this is kind of my initial list that I thought of. But if there's anything else, I would love to hear, from other engineers out there or anyone watching. So you see here device basics. So that's just checking your CPU memory utilization. Don't spike. That's just a common thing that all engineers check after any change. I know even after just connecting a new circuit and changing around some interface config, you got to check it. You just have to check it. BGP neighbors, that's kind of a very common thing, especially with circuit upgrades, since that is the routing protocol. And for this example, I'm going to say a minimum of 2 established eBGP neighbors. So just to unpack that a little bit, in this situation, there's a single router that's connecting to 2 different ISPs. I'm assuming I basically built this out for a small site. Now that changing from minimum of 2 to 1 established BGP neighbors, that's a pretty easy change. So I'm not too worried about that. But I just wanted to that's just the first use case. Looks like we got another Nara. Sorry, I'm not going to be able to say your name properly, but Narasima Arya said hi. So hey, how are you? Thanks for tuning in. So back to the checks, the number of BGP neighbors. So I just assume there's 1 router, 2 ISPs or 2 circuits are being connected to it. And assuming during the upgrade, we're only upgrading 1. But in this case, we could, I guess, upgrade both since these checks are done after the upgrade. For external connectivity, just the basics. Pinging Google, 8888. I think everyone does that, especially after a circuit upgrade. Logging so this you have to understand the severity levels of a Cisco router or a Cisco device. So severity levels go from 0 to 7, where 7's kind of the least. 0 is like, oh no, something's burning, something's crashing and burning. So basically, I have the severity level 3, which is error, and that is basic. It says 3 or higher, but think of it as 3, 2, 1, or 0 severity level, since technically that's like the higher severity but a lower number. It's very confusing. So that's basically what's checked. So all it does is it will go through, do a show logging, and it will look for the certain severity level. If there's anything higher than a 3, then it will error out. That check will specifically error out. So and that's a bit about it for the checks. So like I mentioned, if you're watching and you have any sort of questions, or if you have any other additional checks that you're like, hey, you missed a pretty crucial one, feel free to put it in the chat. I'll write it down, and most likely I'll add it to the list of checks. So those are the checks. The only information that you have to provide, and actually this top field I just re-added in. So PyATS, which we'll go over, requires that you build what's called a testbed file. So what that testbed file it consists of is all your devices that you want to run tests against. Then I'm trying to think the best way to. The testbed file has all of the devices that you want to test against. In our case, that's what it is. In our case, we're only building a testbed for 1 device. And so it really doesn't need to, we don't have to build, normally testbed files, you would test against multiple devices. So you're talking like 5 to 10 devices at least. That's a minimum. And PyATS can build test beds with, I've heard of thousands of devices. But in this case, we're building a test bed with a single device, and it only requires the device host name. So the host name that you would normally get prompted, like if you SSH to the device, you would have the host name like there in your terminal. That's what you would put in this text input. The device OS is very, very important. So the host name in our particular case, I only have it there for logging purposes, because on the back end, PyATS has a mechanism to where it can learn the host name when it logs into the device using the IP address. So this really, to kind of pull back the covers on, it's really just for logging. Not to say you should ignore it, but it's good to have, a legitimate host name in there. The OS is for this tells PyATS what parsers to use. So PyATS has a list and category of parsers, and they obviously, if you've messed with any Cisco device or any different family of Cisco devices, you have iOS, iOS XE, and then I have ASA in here, but there's NXOS. There's all these different operating systems, and they all have slightly different syntax for the same exact functionality. They're getting better, especially with the iOS XE train. They're getting better, but it's still you go from versions, 16.x to 17.x, and they add in just one other explicit command, and it's like, oh, come on. So this device OS is very particular, and you definitely have to make sure this is correct. So, I'll just select it. We won't be able to run through a test. I wasn't planning on running through any sort of test case tonight, just because I wanted to go over the tool itself. But then the last, obvious, pretty self-explanatory, device IP. So you put the management IP address to connect to the device in there. And then you press submit, and it would go out. It would connect to the device, parse out the commands, and then do checks against the parsed information. So it would find the CPU utilization and make sure it's below 75%, and kind of go down the list. And then you'll get a nice printout of all the tests, and whether they passed or failed, and then their reasoning, whether if they passed, what was their CPU utilization. Like, for example, it might say device basics, CPU utilization below 75%, reason CPU running at 30% or whatever. So that's it for the validation piece. And kind of the TBD is just there for my next test case whenever I decide to build that. Right now, my thought around that is a layer 2 test case. So something to deal with a layer 2 access switch. So, spanning tree, checking your stacking ports, uplink interfaces. That, like I said, I'm still kind of figuring out what I want to do with that. So that's kind of there as as a placeholder there. All right, so that's it for the validation. We're about to jump into the code because the other two tabs here, analysis and about, are both under construction, but that just means I haven't got to them. But the analysis, like I said, will be an integration with Batfish, which we'll also go over what that is as well. So before we jump into the code, let me just bring up the docs to PyATS, and so that way you kind of have an understanding. And what I'll do is I'll put this in the chat, so that way anyone tuning in can go to the docs. Hopefully that worked. Okay, yep, it looks like they both sent. So either in Twitch or YouTube, you should be able to watch those or go to that link. So without diving into this, PyATS is basically a testing framework. And like I mentioned before, let me just try to jump to one of the very first. Not everything's Python. Let's see. Actually, that might be the best place to do it. Yeah, so that just explains at a high level. Cool. Thanks, James, for the feedback. Yeah, so let's see. PyATS. So there's two pieces to PyATS, and this kind of is confusing here. So up until like most recently, I noticed in the docs, PyATS and Genie are both like, they're two separate libraries, but a lot of times they're bundled together. So people just assume it's like one or like a combined library. But PyATS is the framework, and is the testing framework, I guess. And Genie is all the tools that are used with that framework. So, oh, they didn't use that example here. So, but the best example I've seen, and I don't know if it's here or not. No, I don't think it is. I'm gonna stay on this page though, because it'll be good talking points. But PyATS is basically like an empty toolbox. It provides, all the mechanisms, carrier tools, it provides the handle to carry the toolbox, provides, the, latches, locks, whatever, to secure the toolbox. But honestly, I mean, there's nothing the toolbox can do without the tools inside. And that's what Genie provides. And I guess you can call it Genie or the PyATS library. I guess that's what they're going to call it. And that, like I said, that's kind of newer. Haven't seen PyATS library publicized too much, but I'm going to probably call it Genie the rest of the stream. And so PyATS, like I said, is kind of the testing mechanisms. Genie has the tools, or all the different tools within the toolbox. So to keep it at a high level, let me explain. Let's go actually to here of a test. I'm trying to show. Here we go. So just to keep it extremely high level for right now, like I mentioned before, a test bed, right? So, this tool has a host name, operating system, IP address that you have to provide. And basically on the back end of this web app, all these inputs are then transferred to the back end, which has this test bed. And this is what's called a YAML format. It's not necessarily Python. When you look at this isn't necessarily Python, it's a YAML file. But this can easily be transformed into like a Python dictionary if you're familiar with Python. So in your test bed, you can, this is a very simple one, and I'm not going to go too deep into it, but you have like basically a header that says, okay, here's my list of devices. And if you don't know too much about YAML, indentation is like super, super key. Like, if you don't have your indentation right, it actually won't work, and you'll get a bunch of errors. So here's your devices, and then in this specific sample test bed, you have two devices, and these are the host names. You know what I referred to, the host name being what matches what the host name would be if you SSH'd into the device. This is where you'd put that, is right here. The type, the OS, and credentials and connections, these are all required. So the different types, there's a whole chart in here to tell you the different types. You can actually get down to the model. So like, for example, if this was a I don't know if CSR is an actual type, but I know like a Cat 9K is a specific type. And the reason that they added type, or why type is in there, is if you can tell you if you can describe, like, because the test bed just describes your devices, in the type field, if it's a Cat 9K, Catalyst 9000, there may be a specific reason, or maybe a specific parser that you could add to in the future, or another feature that you can add to with the newer switches that are out there. So maybe something, a Cat 3K versus a Cat 9K. I mean, there's newer just newer features that are provided with like the newer hardware, newer iOS. So that's kind of what the type. But I wouldn't really like these are both described as router. I've actually put type as like testing device, and it works. It's used to further describe the device. What's super important is actually, I take that back. Type. So that Cat 9K I was describing, that's actually under platform. And actually, I see that there, the Nexus 9KV and the ASR 1K. So if you like describing the actual model, that's actually under the platform key. The type, yeah, I think I've put many different strings in there, like testing device and switch router, like some, yeah, kind of like this, just a very basic description. So, but platform is the one that actually like has meaning to it, that, you know, there's only a select number of platforms that, you know, that you can put in there. What I'm going to pay attention to is the OS. And like I said, this goes back to the operating system, and that ties back to the Genie parsers that you can use. Because remember, Genies are the tools that you use within this toolbox. So the OS is super important, and that's one of the values that gets passed from that form into this testbed. Credentials and connections, they're pretty straightforward. Connections are interesting because besides CLI, you can also use netconf, and I don't believe RESTconf, but you can use Yang as well. I forget. It's all in here. It's all in the documentation. I just don't want to spend too much time going through the documentation, but I did want to provide a pretty solid base for everyone as we go through the code. But in this case, you can tell it's pretty straightforward. CLI, protocols, SSH, and then here's the IPs. And these IPs are, once again, something in my tool it's fed from the front end. And the host name here, just to wrap up this host name should be what's found in the prompt, but there is an option that you can learn the host name. So that's it for a test bed. And, there's so many more features and so many more settings that you can configure within a test bed, but this is at the most basic level. The only thing I didn't cover was alias. Alias can be whatever you want. Here it says helper and UUT. UUT stands for unit under testing, and that's described throughout the documentation as well. So, and then it shows just some other ways that you can create a testbed file. So, if you're not familiar with YAML and you're like, okay, he said indentation was super important, and you don't want to, besides copy and pasting this, you could do something like, if, for example, you wanted to create a testbed of every device in your inventory, let's say you have a few hundred devices on your network, you probably don't want to try to copy and paste this 200 times and change the the host name and the different credentials and whatnot. So there are different ways to add and create your testbed. A couple of let's see. PyATS. Yeah. So Nara. Yeah, I'm gonna. So yeah, since you're asking a few questions here, I'm just gonna. We can. Let's see. Please continue updating. Yeah. The PyATS articles. They kind of wrapped up with that last one, that part 4. I could expand further, but I think at this point it would almost be better to do something like on stream or a YouTube video to address specific, more specific use cases. Shall we use 4 spaces as indentation? Yeah, so I believe it's 4, but whatever you decide, I believe you can use even 2, but whatever you decide to use, you have to keep it the same throughout. So if you decide to do 4, then you have to use 4 all the way through the testbed. If you decide to use 2, you can use 2 all through the testbed. Do all the keys in the YAML file are standard? Does all the keys in YAML file? So I'm not sure what you mean by standard. The documentation provides you with what keys need to be included in the testbed. So I hope that answers your question. So yeah, like here, you have the device block details. So anything under devices, this is kind of what you would, and it tells you here, what should be there. Yeah, here the recommended the name of the hardware chassis for platform. And this is just a small example. There's other things that you can include in the test bed, but this would be a good starter here. So these are the keys you would include. James, as far as network automation, is there minimum number of devices it makes sense to have in the environment to consider using these types of tools and approaches? I don't think there would necessarily be a minimum. I think what the better question may be is what task you're performing. So, for example, something like a circuit upgrade. You're going to have more than one circuit upgrade. And it's, it could be you might have one every few months. You might work at a place where that's all you do in your role. Like that's all it is. So, a task that you repeatedly do, and something that, I would say that's probably more the focus you want to do. Minimum number of devices. I mean, yeah, if you have, let's say like a network of like 5 to 10 devices, I would still highly encourage for you to automate. Actually, if you have less devices and like you were in a network of like, 5 to 10, even let's say up to 50 devices, you could get, if you took some time and really understood and practice and use some of these tools, network automation tools and Python libraries, I mean, you could have that network down pat to where you want to make a change. You could track all your configurations and all your changes in the Git repository. You could have automation flows to where, you want to make a change, you make that change on whatever line of config. There's an automated process that kicks off that opens up your change ticket in like a ServiceNow or any change management software and goes through the approval process. I mean, there's so many things. If you actually had a smaller network, that'd actually be kind of cooler because it'd be easier to get your network under wraps. But yeah, to answer your question, I would say more focus on the task at hand versus the number of devices. Because me personally, I don't think there's a minimum number of devices. Hopefully that answers your question. All right. So that was the test bed. I guess let's get a little more. This is kind of the boring part, like writing the test bed and getting all your information in there of how to log in and whatnot. So let's actually go to parsing output. So as I mentioned before, there's two parts. There's the PyATS library, which is the testing framework, and then there's Genie, or what I'm now finding out it's called PyATS library. Yeah, it's here again. So this is where Genie has all your parsers, your APIs, your triggers, like all these different things that you can use to run against devices. So let me just open this up. Here's a perfect example, and then what I'll do is I'll show what parsers APIs are available. So here you'll see if let me see, what command is this? It doesn't even tell you the show device output before it's parse. Oh, it shows device output. Okay, well, because I don't know the exact command, I want to say it's probably like show interface status or something like that. But I'm not going to guess. What I'll do instead is do Genie parsers. Yeah. So we'll actually switch over to the Genie documentation here. Cool. All right. Actually, this picks up pretty good where we left off. So, and here it's funny enough still called Genie, but back in the other one it's called PyATS library. and not to be confused with PyATS. So that's, well, man, that's kind of whack. So here it's talking about the PyATS library provides a parser. This library is literally just called PyATS. The PyATS library, with it being capitalized there, I'm not sure if they're trying to just merge Genie under PyATS or what the thought is there, but we'll just, like I said, we'll just stick with Genie. So yeah, so here's in Genie, what you do is you can load a testbed file, so testbed.yaml. So going back to our example, well, not there anymore. Going back to that YAML file, that testbed that I just went over, what you would do is load it into your Python script. So this is some Python code here. You would then, if you wanted to test against all your devices, you could connect and parse out configuration or output from all your testbed devices, or like in this case, you can just find that one device. So particularly, I would go with one device, just because, you know, if you're just starting out with PyATS and Genie, it's best to, you know, you don't want to, like, the one thing with automation is if you're not doing it right, it just increases the blast radius to take things down. You know, so whereas many of us have, you know, messed up in the past, or, you know, you do that shut command to that one interface that you probably shouldn't have shut, you know, put that in a Python script and throw it in a loop, then it shuts, you know, X amount more devices or interfaces. So you want to make sure you're automating properly and in a test environment before pushing this out. You know, even running show commands, you know, there's plenty of things that happen under the hood. So yeah, it's probably good just to find, even just in your test environment, just let's pick one device. So here we created a variable called device. Well, I guess I skipped over this. We have a variable called testbed, and this testbed.load here we actually got from the Genie library, and basically it's just a Python module that knows how to translate that YAML file that I showed earlier into something that Genie can read, and overall Python can read. Basically, so then we go down to device, a variable for device. You know, out of our testbed, we have the list of devices, and then we pull out NXOSV1, and this is the host name. So I showed you, or I explained that, hey, you know, you want to make sure you have the host name of, you know, what's in the CLI prompt when you actually SSH to the device. And so you would use that host name here, and it makes sense, you know, out of your testbed devices. And just to go back to the sample testbed. Let's see. I had it here. Validate. Okay. Oh, here it is. So yeah, so if you're reading it here, you'll see, okay, the device that we're looking for is under testbed, you know, referring to this variable, under devices, and the name of it is NXOSV-1. And if you look here, you know, we're under the testbed, devices, NXOSV-1. Oh, back here. And so, all right, so we have this device. So we've stored all the information about NXOSV-1. So all of, you know, what platform it's running, the OS, you know, we know how to log into it using these credentials. Obviously, you wouldn't put this in plain text if you were using this in production. There's many ways. They actually have a way to encrypt credentials. There's ways you can get prompted. So instead of storing even encrypted credentials in your testbed, you can always just ask the user when running the script to plug in a username and password, and then how to connect to it. So PyATS and Genie make it super easy. You literally just define the device. You say, all right, connect to it. You're connected at this point. Parse out show version, which is, you know, it's, as you guys may know, that's a very common command with Cisco devices. And you basically take that output. So what it does is it will connect, run show version, filter that show version output, which is normally like one big, if you've ever seen it in a Cisco device, which we'll jump into the next stream. We'll actually jump into a Cisco device and do all this parsing live. And it's basically a big block of text, like paragraphs of text. It will run it through this parser, and this is the output. And so, you know, for people that aren't familiar with kind of data serialization or data types, or this basically transforms, you know, when you're looking at programming, you have different data types, and one of the data types is, you know, if you were to collect show version from the CLI output, like just, it's called screen scraping basically, but you know, copy and paste, you copy it right out of the output, it would just be one long string. That's what in programming, which sucks. You can't do too much with that. So, you know, instead what Genie provides is a parser, which then you can filter through. So what this allows, and you know, just looking at it at a high level, these curly braces, basically this is what's called a Python dictionary. And these curly braces are like, think of it as like, it's kind of Inception in a way. You know, you kind of keep just digging your way through to the value that you want. So in this case, if you wanted to get, let's say, you wanted to parse out show version across 100 devices in your network, and you're like, man, I really want to know how much boot flash is available on every device, which I don't know why you would, but let's say you really wanted to know that. You could say, okay, output equals, you know, testbed.parse show version, which would run show version against all your devices in your testbed. And you would say here, you'd say, all right, I'm going to do, I'm going to assign a new variable, and we're going to say boot flash equals, and you would literally just say platform. Just think of it as like if you were on a Windows or any kind of computer really, and you were going down a file path, you know, to get to your documents, you normally go to like my computer, my documents, you know, Word docs, and then you know, you're going into those different folders. Think of it, that's the same way you would dig into this. So you would first say platform, and then you would say hardware, and then boot flash. And after you put that as and assign it to a variable, the value of that variable would equal this here, the number, the boot flash available. So, and just to get a little more technical, these are key value pairs. That's what they're called. So these are your keys. Obviously, these are your values. You know when you have key value pairs because of the colon. So in this case, platform is the key. The value is hardware, which has a nested dictionary because of these curly braces here. So, and then these ones are a little more obvious of, you know, key value, key value. It just looks weird when there's only just one key, and then one value, and then a big list of key values. So to put it short, it's much easier to parse through and get the information you want out of this versus if you actually looked at show version. I mean, you're talking like 3 paragraphs of words that you have to somehow find this specific value that you want. And you could use like a combination of regular expressions. I mean, it just gets messy fast. All right. Before we jump into my, so before I jump into the program, this is kind of the documentation Genie offers. There's a bunch of things in here, so I'll actually post this as well in the chat. So if you want to go to this page, this kind of provides, you know, I'll just focus on parsers for right now because there's a lot to dig in here. But let's using, I clicked out of it. We'll use show version as a good example. So we'll look at that parser here in a second. So if you look at, like I mentioned before, Genie only knows how to parse based on the operating system, because essentially Genie just gets this big long string from your output and then puts it through a parser, and it doesn't know which parsers to pick from unless you specify the OS. So you see there's surprisingly more than just Cisco here. That's actually one like perk I find about Genie is they kind of ventured out. I mean, most of it's Cisco, I guess. You shouldn't. But like, for example, Junos, I mean, Juniper is another network hardware vendor and, a competitor at that. And they have parsers for Juniper commands, and a good amount, actually. I mean, it stops there, but I mean, that's a good amount for being hosted on, Cisco DevNet. It's just nice to see that, where it's not excluding other vendors, because all that does is it just invites more audience and more of a crowd to use this tool versus if it was just, a Cisco tool. So let's see. So iOS XE, that's mostly what you're running into these days. If you're, any of the Catalyst switches run iOS XE, and I mean, wireless controllers are moving to iOS XE. There's a lot just going on. I think there will finally be like a golden standard. So these other ones, NXOS, that's your data center. iOS, that's your just vanilla iOS. That's your older devices. And then, all the other ASAs, your firewalls. But what we'll do is just look at iOS XE. I mean, these are all the show commands that you can run against iOS XE devices. And it just keeps going. So all these show commands, basically, these are the parsers for them. So if you see if you see a show command that's interesting to you, that you're like, man, I really like, that's the one I need information about, then great. If not, I highly encourage you, if you have a little experience with regex and parsers overall, just understanding how parsers work in the background. There's actually a couple of good YouTube videos out there. I followed one by Knox Hutchinson, Data Knox on YouTube. He made a parser for Dell. Is it a Dell server? Dell OS, I think, or something like that. And so I followed his, and he actually created a Genie parser. So he actually helped me create my first Genie parser, and which it is actually, it's featured here. Here, it should be right here. Yeah, show license summary. So this is the one I created. It's a very basic one. But with smart licensing becoming so popular, I figured this would be a perfect place to start, because the traditional show license commands don't really work. You have to augment them in some way to get the information you want, because especially with smart licensing, you have to make sure that your licensing is registered and authorized. And if you haven't had a smart licensing headache yet, I'm sure you will. But actually, they just recently changed that, so you may not. They changed the policy around it, but yeah, when it first was introduced, it was tough. How to make Genie parser for any new CLI. So if you have a Genie parser that you would want to make, that's for an OS that's not listed here, you actually would have to create you'd have to check to see if they make a connection type for the device that you want. So there's actually another library called Unicon. Not unicorn, Unicon. Unicon. Let me see if I can find the homepage for it. Yeah, so, okay, maybe not. Maybe it's on the PyATS docs. Unicon, connecting two devices. actually, this site is the one that I was trying to find earlier. So yeah, so if you want to get started with PyATS or just kind of review what I've talked about thus far, that's a good website, or website. It's a good page to start on. This is actually what I was trying to find before. So, but anyways, there is a Python library called Unicon, and it stands for Universal Connector or Connection. And what it will do is that's what powers the SSH connection. So if you've ever heard of NetMiko, it kind of is like that, where it finds it when it SSHs to a device, it tries to look for a specific prompt, and it kind of has think of it as like a conversation, right? When you SSH to a device, you get prompted for a username, password. Okay, plug that in, and then you go back and forth, and username, password. You come back, and it's like, all right, here's your username, password, and then you get a prompt. And then the prompt says, okay, either you get the little arrow, the little caret, or you get the pound sign, and based on your privilege in the SSH session. And all that's basically, to put it short, basically Unicon handles all that. And so you'll have to figure out if Unicon can handle whatever device you're looking at. But if it's in this OS list, then yeah, parser, you can create one. You would have to go to GitHub, Genie parser. So this is where Hey, yeah, thanks James for thanks for joining. Yeah, so the Genie parser here, this is where you would start. There's some good documentation on how to contribute. So yeah, 2 contributors. Here's a YouTube video, and it just goes through, some things you have to do. You have to obviously write a change log to say, all right, what work did you actually do? And then basically write the regex. There's a lot of good examples, and I'm sure this YouTube video will go over it, that you could use. So as an example, well, actually I won't jump into it, but there's plenty of parsers that exist. So all of these that are here are documented. So let me just show you show version. So here's a good example for iOS XE. Here we go. So here, basically, they create a dictionary, and there might be a lot of, you might be like, whoa, that's a lot. But you can see here, here's the key name, and then the class str, that just says what the expected output is. So in this case, you'll have a string for the version short, the platform's a string. Most of it looks to be a string. You can see license type, license level. These are all optional. So that's basically, if it's found, it will be included, but it doesn't necessarily have to be included. But yeah, mostly strings through here. And all this is just the documentation piece. But you can find all of the specifics, like the regex and everything, under src, Genie, libs, parser, and then here's all the different operating systems. And yeah, iOS XE. And there you go. Let's just do show chassis, for example. Here you go. Here's the schema. So the schema is basically what's parsed, or what's the expected output here. And then here, per the contribution standards, you have to have an example of an output. So this is your example output that's commented out, so it might be tough to see. But then here is the regex. This says, if you plug this into regex 101, you'll see, okay, what are we looking for? And you basically parse out these values, and then you fill them in here using these if statements. So you say, hey, if there's a match, the match equals, and then you go up here and says, hey, it matches this line. Then what we're going to do is whatever matches this line here of regex, we're going to put into the chassis MAC key, which if you look at the schema is up here, chassis MAC address. So hopefully that answers your question. I know I kind of just dive into it a little. I go down a rabbit hole real fast, especially streaming. It's definitely different, when you don't have someone, like it's not really a in-person conversation where you can kind of read like, okay, you're kind of going too far, buddy. So that was it for this might be actually a pretty good parser to look at first, the show chassis one, because it's a pretty basic schema, and you see what the output's is gonna be like if you were to run it against a live device, and you can see what they try to parsing out. So also, if you don't want to build one, if you try using a parser and it doesn't get what you're looking for, you could easily fix it, or change the regex around. I wouldn't say fix is the right word, but let's say it has a wacky result, and you're like, hey, actually should have matched on this. You can change create a pull request, which essentially is think of it as a change request. Change what you want in the code, and then send it back, and the contributors of the Genie project will review it, and hopefully it gets merged in. All right. So I'm trying to think of where I was. Oh, so I was just at the parsers. So yeah, so I mean, not too much else to go with. I mean, I could spend hours explaining these, but parsers are pretty straightforward. There's thousands of them. I forget what the latest count is, but there's thousands of these, and this is a good way to start with parsing out, because one of the first things you have to do is take that output from the terminal and parse it into something that your programming language can understand. So in the case of Python, you're looking mostly at dictionaries, Python dictionaries. All right. Let's see. Let me see what's... All right, so let me keep going over the... what I'll do is I'll explain the different frameworks that make up the NetCheck tool, and then probably call it there, because I don't want to jump into the code without having to some time, because if I start jumping into the code, then another hour will kind of just go on by. So let me just go over the frameworks that are involved, and then what I'll do in the meantime after the stream is I'll try to get a README together, and with all the frameworks, so that way you can reference these in the future. So maybe the best way to do this is, and I guess before I even jump into anything, so I'm running all my code obviously is right here on the left side. I'm running my code in the Ubuntu Linux distribution, and I'm running it as a Windows subsystem for Linux. So anyone unfamiliar with WSL, Windows Subsystem for Linux, it's basically a small little Linux container. The reason I use it is it's just so much easier to code and install packages and just overall use Linux, especially through a terminal. So basically I do all my development on there, and then I post my code to GitHub. So so I have, that's what you see down here, WSL Ubuntu 1804. So all the code is on this WSL Ubuntu image, and I'm trying to think what else is there to go over with that. That's about it. I mean, WSL you can run with Windows 10. I haven't really messed with Windows 11. I know it's coming out soon, but I would assume WSL is going to be on that as well. The IDE, or the development environment I'm using, is VS Code. Some people call it an IDE. Some people just think it's a greater Notepad. I think it's definitely an IDE because you can run code. It lints code for you. Checks code, debugs it. You can install a bunch of extensions to help you with your code. So there's plenty of other, and I mean, you see I have Better Jinja, bunch of themes, probably a little too many themes. Remote WSL. So remote WSL is how I actually, because under the hood, Windows is actually SSHing to the WSL instance to open up the folder. So technically I'm like developing this remotely because it's not on my desktop per se. It's on like a little virtual machine, little container on my desktop. But yeah, so that's how I'm developing it. Everything else I don't think I reinstalled, but it was related to Azure. So I'm using VS Code. The theme is just the GitHub Dark theme. I think it's pretty chill versus, I know some people were like really bright, bold themes. It's easier on my eyes. So, and I'll try to include some of that in like the commands and whatnot. I'm still trying to understand the stream life. So, so without jumping into the code, the main frameworks I'm using, or libraries, I guess you can call some of them frameworks. So for the web, I'm using the micro framework for the web and the API, because this is both a web app and an API, and it also has an API, and we'll go over that as well. But just to show you guys, hopefully, oh, it's because it's not running. Hold on, just so I'm not a liar. So here's the API, and it's just the documentation for the API. But so under the hood, it's using Fast API. So if you're familiar with micro or any sort of web frameworks with Python, Flask and Django are the two biggest by far. Oh, definitely with history-wise. Fast API is kind of newer, and I first started it only a couple months ago. I actually first built this out using Flask. I built out this entire app using Flask, and then after reading Fast API documentation and understanding kind of its core principles and some things that it does better, can I say library means group of APIs? Not necessarily, no, because APIs are specific to an application, whereas a library could be something, is basically like a collection of modules that make up like using Python, I would say it's, PyATS is a Python library. It doesn't necessarily have, it has like its own API. It might have an API to interface with the programming language, but no, I wouldn't say, you don't want to say a library is a group of APIs. Yeah, I wouldn't say that. The Moonlight theme, I haven't looked at that, but I will have to check that out. So anyways, so I'm using Fast API under the hood. If you guys I won't post the links. Like I said, I'll try to get like a README together, hopefully within the next few days, so that way you can just like check these links out individually, and read through each framework. You don't have to obviously study them, because I definitely didn't. I went through a lot of like the tutorial, but I still learn new things about these frameworks every day. And I think that's a common misconception sometimes is when you hear about people performing, doing any sort of automation task, and I just ran through PyATS documentation. I mean, I've been looking at PyATS for months. I wrote blog posts on it, but those blog posts, I mean, they took hours to create. There's a lot of work that goes on in the background to really understand these frameworks and be confident to kind of rattle them off. So, don't expect to read through the docs one time, because the PyATS and Genie, I've read through them probably 2 to 3 times. Not obviously cover to cover, but I would say 75% of it 2 to 3 times, because you end up going back over and over and just saying, the littlest details, like, hey, is there a comma there? Is there an extra parameter it needs passed in? So yeah, don't feel pressured to like, oh, Danny used fast API, I better know this, I got to start reading. It's like, no, even the best programmers, everyone goes back to the documentation. And actually, to that point, fast API, I mean, this has by far the best documentation I've read for a Python library. It really, like, he breaks it down so well throughout the whole, the creator of fast API. He breaks it down so well, and he even introduces, like, he goes into just some basics, some Python basics. He doesn't assume anything. So if you ever want to like have a good starting spot and you're thinking about building like a small Flask app or something that like runs on a small web server, like I mentioned, Flask and Django, fast API by far has, I have not looked through, I will say I haven't looked through Django at all, much at all, because I know that's kind of like a batteries included bigger framework. But man, fast API, it has so much built into it, and the documentation's awesome. So besides fast API, I think what else? I'm kind of starting at the base. So we do have a small database. It's using SQLite. You'll see it here, database.db. That is to store results, and not necessarily entire results. What I do is I'm taking the results in from these different PyATS tests and parsing out only the individual components that I want. So for example, there is a key for success rate. So like, out of 100%, what was the success rate of the test? That's a value stored in my database. So like, and let me see if I can. No, I won't try not to go down that path. I don't want to go down the path of showing you specific things about the application, because then this will turn into multi-hour presentation. So anyways, yeah. So there's a database component to it. It's just SQLite. I'm actually using Fast API. The creator maintainer actually created another awesome library called SQL Model, and that's here. And I mean, you can kind of tell just by the appearance, but SQL Model, SQL databases for Python. It runs basically SQL Alchemy. It's a layer above, a thin layer on top of SQL Alchemy, which I'm throw in an acronym, an ORM, or an Object Relation Mapper. So what that does is basically it allows Python to talk to the SQL database. So anyone that doesn't understand really databases, and I'm definitely no expert, their databases have a syntax. So like to get everything in a database, you would type out select star from and then the name of the table. I guess everything from that table, not everything from the database. So, and that basically is like, think of it as like select all. And so taking that language and putting it into Python, or trying Python to interact with that language directly, it would be tough. So they created these tools which are called ORMs, and really object, what did I just say? Object, no, I'm not even gonna, I can't remember it now. ORM, object relational mapper, there we go. And it basically maps between Python, the Python programming language, and SQL. Because SQL or SQL is the language, the programming language per se of databases for how you interact with databases. So yeah, so I'm using SQL model. Pairs very well with Fast API, as you can imagine, since they're built by the same person, same team, I guess, at this point. And yeah, see, SQL databases and Fast API. This actually, I didn't stumble on this until after I did it the hard way. There's a way that you have to, you can model the data, and then you have to serialize the data. And serialize, I mentioned the word before, and I didn't really explain myself. It basically transforms the data into different data types per se, or data structures. So I showed for example, a Python dictionary, right? With the curly braces. Well, there's another structure, and this is kind of a poor example, called a Python list. And there's different ways of interacting with it. So actually, that's not a good example at all. I'll just skip serialization. But anyways, it's just transferring between two data structures. So that SQL model helps simplify that. And you'll see this Pydantic. We'll get into that the next stream. It's used to validate and basically helps you program. It validates, it serializes. It does a few different things for moving data between, like, for example, SQL, a database, and interacting with it through Python. So, but Pydantic helps with another concept. It's most popular for type hinting, it's called. And basically what that does is just how we looked at the parsers. I don't know if I still have one up. Yeah. So just as we look with the parsers, how this tells you, okay, for example, RF profiles is going to be a string, or there's an expected string value. That's what a type hint basically is. It says, okay, well, RF profiles is a string, and its return output is expected to be a string. So seems like a very basic concept, but when you're programming and you don't have type hints, it makes programming very tough. And I mean, it doesn't really make it tough. It's easier with type hints. So anyways, Fast API, SQL model, those are kind of the back end power horses there. What else do I have here? Just open up another terminal here, just so I can look through. All right. Trying to stick with the back end stuff for right now. PyATS and Genie we've already gone over. That takes care of all the validation testing. So I created the test in the background that Fast API will pass in the values for, run the test, and then it will be returned back to, basically returned to Fast API, which then in turn returns the results to the front end. And so the front end, I guess that's kind of it for the back end. I'm sure I'm missing something, and we'll go over this more in the next stream, since we'll be actually working through it. I'll kind of talk through it, but then we'll actually be coding and whatnot. But for the front end, we're using a mix of obviously HTML and CSS. Just open up another window here. HTML and CSS, but more specifically, you might be like, wow, this looks really nice. You must have spent a while on this. Not at all. This is actually called Bootstrap. It's basically a framework that allows you to, and I'll actually pull up the theme, darkly Bootstrap theme. So Bootstrap is kind of a base framework, and there's a bunch of these free websites. You can also buy Bootstrap themes, because this is a personal project. Obviously, I won't be doing that, unless I found one that I absolutely loved. But yeah, so you basically, you download the CSS HTML for this, and then you kind of just look at these code examples. Like here, like this is the code for this nav bar, for example. So yeah, kind of just played around with that, figured that out, and so it's Bootstrap. And then for the different results, which, like I said, we'll get into next time, to pass the results to the front end, I also use Jinja 2 templating language, and that basically just allows you to pass in variables and pass in values into your HTML. So pretty basic, something very similar. I mean, it's just like a Flask app in that way, if you've ever built an app using Flask. So yeah, that's it kind of for the front end. The API, like I said, I won't go over it right now, but it is functional. So for example, I created just 2 basic endpoints. That's what these are called, the endpoints, with all the different calls down here. Well, I guess these are technically endpoints, but think of it, PyATS and Batfish, these are kind of the 2 underlying frameworks that I'm relying on. So I just figured, just to make it simple, I'll just call it PyATS Batfish. Default, these are actually front end pages. I have to actually get rid of these off the API screen, because you shouldn't see these. But for example, like if you wanted to get a list of all the tests, so let's say you wanted to integrate this with other with another tool, right? You would use this API. So I actually, in my script, I didn't show it here, I actually have a list of create test results. So it actually creates dummy test results for me, so that way every time I start the app, it puts these test results into the database. So that way I can query it, like, on stream or as I'm testing or debugging. So in this case, since I've restarted the system a few times, there's, normally I just have these 3 here: circuit upgrade, WAN check, L2 STP check. So I just, like I said, they're kind of just dummy results or dummy variables. But they've been populated, so that way you could actually query against these. But this is kind of what the database or the API would look like. So that way, if you wanted to use this tool, my idea was, you could do a GET request, an API call to this tool, and say, hey, I want to know the requests for this specific time for this name of the test. So like in our case right now, we just have a test called circuit upgrade, but let's say we have another one called WAN check, right? Let's go back. Right, WAN check would be the name, and then this is the time it executed, the success rate, failure rate, test passed, test failed, and then the ID. And the ID is just an auto incremented number. So yeah, so that's kind of like, and all these values are pulled from the database. So they're first, the test is ran, stored in the database, right? The results are stored in the database, and then these results are then, for the API call, pulled from the database and then formatted in a way that you're, like, if a programmer got this data back in this format, they could easily interact with this, and they could post it, like, let's say on a monitoring dashboard or something like that. So that's the idea behind that. But the nice part is, this /docs, because we use type hints and using fast API, this was all auto-generated for me. I didn't have to write any of this. So like, you're probably like, wow, like how do you get this drop down, and how do you get the try it out button, all that. All this is auto-generated when you build a fast API application, as long as you build it correctly, with the proper routes and whatnot. But like I said, if you go to fast API in the tutorial user guide, I mean, you can easily run through, it looks like a lot, but if you go to the specific sections that you're looking for, so like for example, like cookie parameters, I haven't looked at that yet. But there are plenty of other ones that, like, I've referenced multiple times. So, but yeah, I mean, they're just there. You know, the API documentation kind of is like just comes, it's included, so fits my use case. But all right, well, let me think. I covered the back end with Fast API, SQL model, front end. Well, in the back end with Genie, PyATS. Like I didn't have time to go over Batfish tonight. That's a whole other conversation. And honestly, I don't think it's pertinent right now, since we don't even have it integrated, or honestly, I haven't really done too much testing with it. So the next time on the next stream, what we'll do is we'll start diving into the code. We won't really need to review the code too much, but I'll do a quick refresher of what we're doing, and then what we plan to accomplish on stream. But I really appreciate everyone jumping on. I saw a few people come and go, but yeah, this is it for stream number 1. I really appreciate everyone jumping on, and yeah, if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free you can message me on Twitter, you could DM me, however you want to communicate with me on Twitter. DevNet Dan, I had it on the intro, and it will also be on the outro as well. If there's anything you want to see or just have a general discussion about, yeah, feel free to message me. But in the meantime, hope everyone has a good night, and I will be announcing my next stream probably sometime tomorrow. I'll be announcing, but just know that hopefully probably Thursday night I'm looking to do another stream, and we'll dive a little deeper in the code. So cool. Well, appreciate everyone jumping on, everyone that was in the chat room. Appreciate just the dialogue, and I will see you guys next time.
Hold me close till I get up. Time is barely on our side. I don't wanna waste what's left. The storms we chase are leading us, and love is all we'll ever trust. Yeah, no, I don't wanna waste what's left. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, till my shadow turns to sun rays. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, and on we'll go. Finding life along the way, melodies we haven't played. No, I don't want no rest. Echoing around these walls, fighting to create a song. I don't wanna miss a beat. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, till my shadow turns to sun